very much, Christian. So, thank you for braving what is a rainy night here in Tokyo. Thank you for coming. If you're joining us online, you have not had to experience the rainy nights in Tokyo, but thank you for joining us online. We're here to talk about this book, The Lost Ways of the Good, and we are here with author Father Thomas Plant. Father Thomas, would you like to perhaps introduce yourself for anybody who doesn't know you?
Certainly. First of all, thank you very much, Gordon, and everyone at St Albans for hosting this event. It's been my pleasure to serve here a few Sundays while you're waiting for your new rector, Father Michael, to get his visa to come to the States, and that's how we built on this connection here. A bit of background on me. I was ordained as a priest in the Church of England. I'm now serving in the Japanese Anglican Church, the Nippon Seiko Kai, as a university chaplain at Rikyo University, an Anglican university in Tokyo. Without probably want to go back too far in life, I wasn't brought up in an Anglican family. The church didn't feature very much in my early life. In fact, by the time I got to university to read classics, I was a pretty staunch atheist and very much a materialist. I didn't think that there existed anything beyond, what I can see and touch and smell and so on. And it was coming to Japan about 20 years ago now. It doesn't feel like that long. Having certain experiences with Buddhism in particular, with a Buddhist monk. It's almost a cliche, I came away on a year away to find myself and practice martial arts with a Buddhist monk. But yes, I did. Practicing Aikido down in Kochiken, and conversations with him opened my mind to the possibility of something beyond the purely material. I then went back to Britain, found myself quite unexpectedly to me working in an Anglican cathedral school down in Exeter. One of my duties was taking the children to evensong, so I was forcibly exposed to some of the beauty of the Anglican tradition, and I found myself in a little church that was offering something called Benediction Vespers. I had no idea what these things were, but when I got in there and smelled the incense and felt the palpable silence in between the psalms and saw what I didn't recognise was the host being elevated, something touched my heart and drew me towards the faith. So I started training for priesthood in 2008 in Cambridge, Westwood House, and that's when I undertook my PhD looking at Jodo Shinshu, Shinran's Shin Buddhism, which might need a bit of explanation a bit later on, in comparison with the Christian Platonic thought of this shadowy figure called Pseudo-Dionysius. I don't much like this pseudo for reasons that I might come on to, but that's the basis of this book, although the book goes on quite a bit further than that, and I fill things in between. I then served in parishes in St Albans Diocese, in London and Camden Town, then as a school chaplain at Lichfield Cathedral School, so going back to my cathedral school roots, and finally came here, 17-year gap between leaving Japan and coming to Japan to serve at Rikyo this time last year. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll get to know you better as the evening goes on. Just to explain to everyone how we're going to do this, we're going to start with a few questions to go through some of the main themes of the book, so I'll be asking Father Thomas questions. We will then move on to an audience question and answer session towards the end. So if you have any questions, do please ask them. There's a microphone here in the church which you can come up and ask questions from. We will also be taking questions from anybody who's watching online. So if you have a question, please leave it in the comments on either Facebook or YouTube, and we will try to get to your questions as well. Okay. So, to begin with, Father Thomas, we're starting off with quite an ambitious question here, but what are the philosophical and theological errors that have led to the problems of Western modernity?
And that in a way is the thesis of the book, I suppose. I don't think there are many people who think these days that the West, how we want to construe that, has got everything absolutely right. I think that there was perhaps rather greater confidence in that way of thinking about 100 years ago. but that confidence has proven itself pretty misplaced in the 20th century, and now people are questioning it for all sorts of reasons today. It seems that we have a castle built on very shifting sands, and a lot of assertion without a great deal of backing behind it, because we've lost the we've in a way we've lost or discarded, or we've tried to hush away and push into the corner what we now seem to consider quite embarrassing metaphysical, supernatural, non-material building blocks of our society and the way we view the world. And I think that this derives ultimately from a mistaken view of reality. Who hasn't got a mistaken view of reality to some extent? But I mean, or even more than that, a refusal to admit or to even say that questions about what might be real other than the material, to refuse even to ask such questions, or to say that such questions might make sense. I think this can be pinpointed actually to a theological moment, to the theological problem, which really came to a head in the 13th century, as I go into my book. Right? I mean, if you push me on that, or you want to go with that.
So, this started in the 13th century.
The ground was laid before then, but you could, okay, so, yeah, let me be a bit more concrete with what I was saying. Broadly, what I'm trying to argue in the book is that for around 1,000 years after Christ, there was what's called a philosophical realism. That is, realism, believing that higher principles, invisible things that sometimes St. Paul talks about in St. John, the invisible things are at least as real and arguably even more real than the physical things. So, you know, you cannot have physical reality. You can't have the sun, the moon, the planets, and so on, anything in existence, without certain immaterial principles, especially, of course, number. You know, without the differentiation of 1, 2, and 3, you can't really have anything. You can't have any mathematical laws, physical laws that govern the universe. Nothing can exist without these immaterial laws. And there was a sense, which is broadly a Platonic sense, that these are more fundamental to reality than this actual stuff that we mostly in our everyday lives consider to be real. I mean, it's a crude characterization, but it's not totally totally wrong to characterize it as a difference between Plato and Aristotle. I think I drew attention to a fresco in the Vatican, very famously, where Plato is there pointing upwards, and Aristotle's there with his hand pointing downwards. The Aristotelian way of thinking we can understand the world is to look at things more or less empirically, trial and error, experimentation, and the laws then, they have a reality for Aristotle, but they're particular to those things, and they're mental, to some extent they're mental maps made by the human mind. For Plato, pointing upwards, those laws have to necessarily, logically pre-exist the things that follow those laws. And so his finger's pointing upwards, and they are, if you like, ideas or forms in the mind of God. It is how it will come to play in later Platonic tradition. So, good grief, yeah, you've got in the first millennium in the West, and I don't want to focus too much on the West because in some ways the West is a bit of a sideshow in the worldwide story of philosophical development. But since that's where we're starting, you've got a West that's dominated intellectually by monasticism in what's called the so-called Dark Ages, where men and women are thinking through reality in an atmosphere of prayer, reflection, meditation. They're meditating upon the scriptures, of course, but also upon physical phenomena as well. But it's a from the top down, from God downward view of the world. it's when certain of Aristotle's works, which were lost very much completely lost to Europe, including the ability even to understand Greek for the most part, were recovered, putting it somewhat mildly, through interaction with Muslims, not entirely peaceable, partly the Crusades and partly the reconquest of Andalusia, that access to certain of Aristotle's works, including his metaphysical works, was regained. They'd all been lost. And so you've got this new thought. Of course, it's not new. It was about 1,400 years old, but it was new to the West, coming back in around the beginning of the second millennium and shaking things up. And it was Aristotle's thought as it had been interpreted by Jewish, Muslim and Christian scholars actually living in the Islamic world, vast Islamic world, all the way from what's now Spain, right through all along the Silk Road, in fact. Huge kind of melting pot of ideas. But that starts to throw in a challenge to the way people are thinking. And inadvertently, I think, that leads to two particular figures, one Duns Scotus and one William of Ockham. And this isn't just me making this. This is quite a fairly well-established thesis. It's certainly debatable, but the thesis is well-established. By the time you get to Duns Scotus, this Franciscan, who, despite his name, I think is actually Irish, he wants to say that rather than the universe being this kind of Platonic idea of the mind of God, the sort of expanding into what we know as reality, everything overflowing from the contemplation of the good and the one, the God as understood by Platonism. Instead of this, rather we need to focus on the divine will. It's about what God decides. And this is because God is being seen less as the source of all being, himself totally beyond being, and more as being itself, or worse, possibly even a supreme being among other beings. You're a being, I'm a being, these things are being. God is a much sort of bigger, not literally, but God is the supreme being among others. And that puts us at odds with God. It means that you've got God's will on the one hand and then ours on the other. To the extent that, Duns Scotus says, actually, if God had willed certain of the Ten Commandments to be the opposite of what they would be, then that would have been, that would be fine, that would be true. If God said, thou shalt kill, then killing would be right. So there's an increasing disconnection between the idea of God as fundamentally the good from which all life and being springs up, like from a fountain or a well, and a disconnection between the physical, the sort of, the laws of physics and of nature and so on, and the divine, a disconnect between those, and a suggestion that actually God's nature as goodness might be something separate from God's will. God could will the opposite in a way. God could will anything, and it would be good just because God says so. There are a lot of people who see God in that way. I think Richard Dawkins and so on would see God in that way. How can you worship this being who could just say, today killing is wrong, tomorrow go out and slay some Saracens, but therein I think lies the nucleus of the problem. It goes more extensively with William of Ockham, who says, actually God could have overturned any of the commandments. Anything God wills would just be right because God says it. And God is supreme being among others, different from us. So we're in a kind of conflict with God rather than continuity with God.
Okay. So, I think that makes sense. Do you think, you were talking there about very ancient roots for this problem. Do you think that this disconnect has got worse recently, or is this something that's been present for a long, long time in Western society? I mean, I think
I think it has. I think that sense of God, of what God is, that sense of God as, a sort of supreme version of us, rather than us being made in the image of God, God being made in our image. God is something we've made up completely because there is no God really, or even if there is a God, as something, someone against whom to rebel, because the belief in God or even God himself could be responsible for wickedness and injustice, even commanding wickedness and injustice. I think that's a fairly kind of stock, popular atheist position that doesn't take into account the philosophical inheritance, whereby God is not, was not traditionally seen as the supreme being among other beings of the same category. We've got this category of beings, God's the big one and we're lesser ones, but rather as my beloved Dionysius the Areopagite would have it, beyond being, the source of all being, but not a being. All things that exist, all beings are reflections of God. All things come from God, and therefore we can know something of God through those, through each other particularly, of course. And yet God is not identified with them. God is both immanent within all things, and therefore knowable through all things, and yet utterly beyond everything we can possibly imagine. It's as the psalmist says, that God is totally beyond all our comprehension. And as St. Augustine says, if you can understand it, it's not God. God in his essence is beyond being and so beyond comprehensibility. But God in what we call his energies, his self-expression in all things in this world, is naming himself in a kind of song, a kind of cosmic hymn to himself, which is how Dionysius and several Muslim thinkers also, and Jewish thinkers also see, taking this Platonic idea, reality as being a song pouring from the heart of reality, which we call God for want of a better word.
So, yeah, it's a beautiful picture, beautiful image of how we can attempt to understand God. I started by asking about the problems of Western modernity. What are...
Yes, I don't think I answered them, but yes.
Well, maybe you can answer it now. What are Christian resources for resisting the kind of problems that we have?
I mean, I suppose the obvious answer is going to be Scripture, isn't it? But it's less obvious when you think, how on earth do we read Scripture? I don't think it's enough to say, here you go, here's a Bible, off you go and read it. And in fact, one might argue that a lot of the problems of today are precisely through doing that. So what is the matrix through which we can read Scripture? Indeed, what is the matrix through which we can look at the universe in a way which is comprehensible and has integrity? And I would say we need to reconcile Scripture with our ancient philosophical roots, and I mean particularly our Greek philosophical roots, with our Plato and our Aristotle, and with the vast traditions that have stemmed from them. And not to do that within a kind of Western philosophical bubble, because actually to call either Scripture or Greek philosophy Western, I think is really problematic. It's almost the school textbook definition. You've got Western religion, Western philosophy, Christianity, Plato, Aristotle, and then Eastern is almost everything else, and we don't even think about African or Native American or what have you very much at that level at all. But really, the Scriptures themselves were born of a vast cultural melting pot at risk of platitude. Moses and his people spent decades among the Egyptians. It would be very unlikely not to have wider Middle Eastern and indeed Egyptian wisdom within the Old Testament, and indeed it is there, and you can see overlaps and parallels with other ancient Near Eastern cultures. I'm telling you things I'm sure you already know. And by the time of the latest books of the Old Testament, and especially the Apocrypha, and of course the New Testament, these are being written in Greek, and Jewish people are reading them primarily in Greek. Hebrew is their liturgical language, but for most of them, their spoken language is Greek. And of course, Greek philosophical ideas permeate the New Testament and large parts of the wisdom tradition, including parts of the Apocrypha. So we can't think of, this is a Western thing, a Western problem. And actually, it's not unconnected to Plato either. I mean, there are those who called Moses, who actually thought that Plato had studied Moses. I mean, I think that's far-fetched, but certainly the ancient Platonists, including pagan Platonists, not just Christian and later Muslim ones and Jewish ones, they thought that Plato himself and his predecessor and influencer, Pythagoras, that they'd had a certain amount of contact with both the ancient Hebrew ways of thinking of the world and Indian philosophy as well. So I see that ancient philosophical inheritance as a way of bridging the supposed, kind of encyclopedic gulf between Western thought, Western religion, and everything else. Because what I'm trying to get at in my book is that the way, especially Eastern Christianity and Islam, extended all the way along the East Road to China, you can see how there was historically mutually comprehensible ways of talking about true reality, and that we can't all just be pigeonholed into these different religions. That itself a kind of 19th century idea that just helps us to make sense and divide and conquer all these different ideas. There were mutually comprehensible dialogues that could happen that I think are denied now. It's almost as if, no, you've got your belief, we've got ours, and there's nowhere to meet in the middle. We've got no common philosophical framework, no common tongue. We've just got, whoever can shout the loudest from the top of their particular little hill, or by extension, whoever's got the loudest armies to crush the infidel. And that works all ways, historically, Christians, Muslims, Jews, pagans, even Buddhists at some points have tried to crush opposition by violence. Good grief, we've got more in common philosophically, I think, with one another than we have with the idea that this is all there is. And we just need to grab as much as we can by sheer power.
Okay. Yes. Do you think, as you were talking there, I began to wonder, is part of the problem that people simply aren't familiar with the kind of ideas that you're talking about? I mean, you mentioned scripture first there. How many people these days are familiar with scripture? And then connecting it to Greek philosophy, I mean, again, how many people know their way around Greek philosophy? Is that what we've lost?
Yeah, sure. And unfortunately, those routes have been deliberately, those areas of study have been deliberately denied to young people quite systematically. I think in my own country, certainly. I think less so in certain parts of continental Europe. I'm not sure quite what the situation would be in the States. But the idea of reading, because that ancient tradition didn't just end, it expanded in the West into the wonders of medieval thought, which, I mean, you read medieval philosophy and medieval poetry and so on. I mean, you read Dante, and good grief, if anyone wants to think that that's Dark Age, barbaric, stuff, they just haven't read it. But it extends on. It didn't die out, and the Platonic strand in Europe continued through, often through female mystics actually, and writers, Hildegard von Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and so on, through poets, through philosophers to a great extent as well. The Cambridge Platonists would be an example. The prayer book tradition and Lancelot Andrews in the Church of England and Hooker and George Herbert's great Anglican priest poet, all the way up to the Oxford movement in the 19th century, were all very much Platonically inspired. And if we're sticking with England for a minute, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, Dorothy L. Sayers, Evelyn Underhill, great spiritual director of the 20th century, their books are still readily available in print. Wonderful. Highly Platonically influenced. Tolkien, of course, well known, but people haven't been given the intellectual tools to scratch under the surface of Tolkien, say, and see what's really going on under the bonnet of the Lord of the Rings. It's there, and it's not that long ago that people were still talking about this stuff in the mainstream in best-selling books. 70 years ago, 50, 60. In the East, in the Islamic world, the Platonic strand of thought very much continued in the Sufi tradition, which now has been marginalised by Wahhabist and more fundamentalist strains of Islam. But again, that's only the last 120 years or so. We lose sight of the fact that there was this great Platonic richness, and fans of the Sufi poets will know this well. But it continued, and it continues quietly to this day. In fact, Plato was on the syllabus of all the madrasas in modern-day Iran until fairly recent, I believe. But therein lies another story.
Okay. And we're here in Tokyo, in Japan. How does all of this relate to the spiritual and philosophical context in Japan?
Yeah, sometimes I wonder whether this would have made a separate book, actually, rather than because I've tried to frame the book as a journey from this figure Dionysius the Areopagite, the 6th century pseudonymous, probably Syrian monk who wrote in the spirit of the convert at the Areopagus in Acts 17. There's this Greek philosopher Dionysius, who Paul kind of wins over and converts by pointing to the plinth of the unknown God. And Dionysius and these other Greek philosophers think, yes, the unknowable God. This is like the Platonic or even Stoic idea. So some of them follow him, and one is Dionysius. Well, 500, 600 years later, this Syrian monk takes his name and sort of lives through him. I don't think he's just copying his name. There's a debate, and you can read it in the book. I don't think he's just pretending to be him to gain credibility, although there are people who do argue that. I think he's inhabiting both the Greek philosophical and the Christian inheritance. But you've got him, and he's probably based in Syria. He's writing in Greek, so you can't say that's Western. I'm trying to trace all the way from him through along the Silk Road, via Islam, the churches of the East, all the way along to China, where we've got actual, historical evidence with the so-called Nestorian Eastern Christian stele, where you've got the Christian faith on this big stone put up in phrases that are comprehensible in Buddhist and Taoist terms. And indeed, the emperor there accepted the Christian missionary bishop, Alopen, and accepted his religion and legalized it for a long time. Funnily enough, not funny, but those Christians are the predecessors of the modern day Uyghur, who retained, of course, their belief in the one God and are being tried severely for it to this moment. But there, historically, the trail stops. There's no evidence that Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, true Pure Land Buddhism, has some direct connection historically. There's a gulf. There's literally a sea in between China and Japan for a start. And I'm not suggesting historical connections between Shin Buddhism and historic Platonism. However, what I am trying to do is show where there are philosophical benefits in putting these two figures, Dionysius on the one hand and Shinran, the founder of true Pure Land Buddhism in Japan, on the other, one in the 6th century, one in the 12th to 13th, and put them together as thinkers. Why? Because Dionysius comes from what I suppose you might call is what's often seen or criticised, especially by Buddhists, as our Christian dualist tradition. There's God up there and there's us down here and never the twain shall meet, But what I've tried to articulate is that that's not the only way to look at Christian ideas of God and us. It's not the only way to look at reality. And then on the other hand, you've got Shinran within his tradition, his Buddhist tradition. He was accused, Buddhism is non-dualistic by and large, and I don't want to misrepresent Buddhism here, but he's been accused, rightly or wrongly, and it's debated among Buddhists, of being dualistic. Because for Shinran, maybe I need to introduce Shinran at this point, I don't know, I haven't done that, have I? I don't know how, people might not be I suppose people might be here or might be watching who know a bit about Dionysius or know a bit about Shinran or a lot about one or the other, but I'm going to try and cover everything in a lot of ground in a small amount of time. Well, Shinran, 13th century, Kyoto, he came from the same monastery as the two of the other greats, Nichiren and Dogen. So Nichiren, the founder of Nichiren Buddhism, now with its very famous offshoot all around the world, the Soka Gakkai, and Dogen, the founder of Zen, obviously well known throughout the world, despite the fact that only about 2% of Japanese people are Zen Buddhists. And then you've got Honen and Shinran from the same Tendai monastery. And they say rather differently that the situation was dire in medieval Kyoto. There'd been earthquakes, fires, there'd been monastic corruption, and there was a call for reform, basically. They thought the end of the Dharma age had come, Mappo. And so these three reformers called for different ways of doing things. Nichiren said, no, we go straight to the Lotus Sutra, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, that's it, and only that will guarantee us the proper rebirth necessary for enlightenment. Dogen goes off to China, finds Chan, called in Japanese Zen, and it's about jiriki, self-power, entering the self, meditation, sitting, returning to the pristine teachings, as he thought of it, of the historical Buddha. That's how we cut the karmic ties, gain the better rebirths for enlightenment. Honen and Shinran, Pure Land Buddhists, came from a different strand, called the Pure Land or Jodo strand of Buddhism, where they, I'm putting this in a nutshell, I hope I don't misrepresent it, but the idea is that it is not through one's jiriki, self-power, but through trust in the Buddha of immeasurable light and compassion, Amitayus or Amida Buddha, putting trust in his karmic merit and his infinite wisdom and compassion, not through one's own works, but through shinjin, sometimes translated as faith alone, that one is granted complete severance of ties to rebirth. So you end your ties to you're not going to be reborn. You have guaranteed nirvana, enlightenment, possibly even here and now. It's debated among Buddhist scholars. Okay, so as an aside, when the Jesuits arrived a few hundred years later, they thought maybe that Luther had got there before them, because this sounds rather a lot like salvation by faith alone. Put your shinjin in the Buddha. I don't think that's fair, but a lot of Protestant scholarship has been based on that. And Shin Buddhists don't like to be characterized as Protestant Christians without the Jesus bit, without the difficult bits. They don't, and rightly so, because Shin Buddhism is properly, Mahayana Buddhist school, derived from the Mahayana, with no evidence of historical influence from Christianity of one form or another. It developed in this way from Mahayana Buddhist sources. All right, I'm sort of banging on a bit here now, but what that led to within Buddhism were accusations, particularly by Zen Buddhists, that Shinran Shinran's thought is not really orthodox, because it's about putting your trust in something, in an external Buddha, Amida Buddha. It's about becoming one, indeed, or realizing one's oneness with the Buddha through the Buddha speaking the Buddha's name, the Nembutsu, through the practitioner. And debates raged for hundreds of years. it's in the late 19th century that Shin Buddhist scholars really started to try to consolidate with other Buddhists in Japan. And that's partly in the reaction to Western influences at this point. Because after the Meiji Restoration, 1867, you've suddenly got an influx of Christian missionaries, and you've got Japan trying to establish itself as a modern, in Western terms, nation state. What this meant was there's a certain threat from the Christian missionaries. There's also a growing notion of Shinto as, and I've got to be careful here, state religion or non-religion. This was debated right up until, and possibly even after the Second World War. A couple of good recent books on that, one by Jolly and Baraka Thomas, which I recommend. And that's another matter. But as a result of this, Buddhists felt a need to have greater solidarity with one another. And you find that Shin Buddhists are downplaying their doctrinal uniqueness, their kind of their dualistic tendency. But the way I'm seeing this is you've got Shinran with this, coming from a non-dualist tradition, but with a kind of dualistic tendency. I'm going to not go further there, you have to look at it in the book. I don't want to misrepresent Shinran. And on the other hand, you've got Dionysius from a Buddhist critiques of Christianity that we're dualistic. But then you've got Dionysius as a more kind of non-dualistic, edging Christian thinker. And he's not alone in that. And so it seems to me that's where you can bring those two into some quite creative theological and philosophical dialogue about the true nature of reality. It also helps that Japan was not a Western colony. Post World War II, MacArthur and so on, you could debate that status, but certainly in the 19th century, no. And so there's a different relationship between Christianity and Christianity in Japan has a different relationship with the native Japanese traditions than Christianity in countries where Christian forces conquered those countries. Let's say, Hong Kong, Singapore, Africa, parts of, and so on. So, that puts Japan in a very interesting position where it has self-consciously adopted certain aspects of Western modernity and self-consciously rejected others, and is in possibly a unique place in that regard.
Just to let you know, everybody, in about 5 minutes, we're going to start taking questions from the audience. So if you have any, or if you'd like to think of any questions, we'll be coming to you very soon. Before we do that, I was thinking, I guess my question in its simplest terms is, what can we do? Well, thinking about where we are, where do we go from here? How do we find the way back to the root?
Yeah. And the practical question is an important one. There's the sort of Dreher's Benedict option, very popular book, of course, and it's characterized. He actually resists this characterization. So respect for him. I don't want to play on that too much, but the idea that we should retreat into kind of, he says it's not about retreating, but certainly form intentional, almost monastic-like Christian communities where we school our children in Christianity, because they will not, to protect, I suppose, them from very anti-Christian influences, particularly in the States and in our country, where we try to do what the Benedictine monks did and preserve the classical inheritance and pass it on. We form our own universities or non-universities. We try and subvert those processes. We have our own study groups for people that are not, places where you spend a fortune just to be there for 3 years and have a certificate at the end to show you've been there. And you're not there just to deconstruct all of the great classics of literature, but actually to enjoy them and read them and learn from them and grow with them. A philosophical, theological, and literary liberal arts curriculum that isn't dedicated purely to burning books or destroying reputations. That would be a good start. However, but Dreher says that's not hunkering down. It's not a bunker mentality. Okay, that's debatable. But what, of course, he's not saying, I don't think, he's saying that we should do is do anything really interreligious. And that's where I differ, if I've understood him rightly. Apologies if I haven't. But I think that what we need to do practically is study not only, Christians shouldn't just be studying Western classics, but also with Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Shinto practitioners, Taoists. I think we need to be studying and thinking and practicing together and standing against some of the more divisive forces in the world and confrontational forces.
Thank you. Now, I think we will go to the questions now. First, is there anybody here in church who has a question? And if you do, if you could stand up and come to the mic at the front. Don't be shy. Nobody here? Okay. We're also looking at questions online. Do you have any questions from online? All right, Mark, perhaps you could come to the microphone and read that for us.
Okay, I have a question from Andrew Webb. He's asking, can you see any parallels between the Christian notion of self-emptying of God and beings and the Nembutsu?
Yes. And hello, Andrew. I don't know where the camera is, where I should wave, but hello, Andrew. And greetings. Yes, okay. So, Andrew, forgive me if I get this wrong, but the principle behind the Nembutsu, which is the principal practice of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, of Shinran's school, true Pure Land Buddhism, is that through the practitioner saying the name with deep entrusting, with Shinjin, it's not that the person saying it says the name and the Buddha answers in some way, manipulates the Buddha nature or something like that. Rather, through, of course, I'm trying to put into words an experience that my Buddhist friends will say is beyond words. But in my understanding of it, it's that Amitabha Buddha speaks through the practitioner, that one is a vehicle of the karmic merit of the Buddha. There's a realization there. And that could happen through one saying of the Nembutsu in one's life, but one continues to say it in gratitude. So it's not an egotistic act. It's not an act of self-power, because of course you can argue, well, actually, saying Namo Amida Butsu is an act of the self. But in the Shin Buddhist understanding, it's not, because when it's said truly, it's not you who's saying it, or rather it is, but it's the Buddha saying it through you, and the distinction between you and Buddha is eliminated. Okay, well, what on earth might have that have to do with Christianity? Comes to Philippians 2, 5, 6 to 11, I think. And this idea of God self-emptying. Now, here I am a Christian priest, and to my shame, I haven't mentioned Christ explicitly in this talk. And so here we are. And sometimes people accuse Dionysius of, they say he should be talking about Christ rather more. I think he is the whole time. I think it takes Bonaventure, medieval Franciscan Platonist, to really, bring this out of Dionysius. But it's there because Dionysius is always talking about God's self-emptying. God is kenosis, emptying in a way. Now we see this in time because we are creatures born in time, we live in time. We see the outpouring of God's grace in the creation of everything. We see this as a moment of time, sustaining everything. God self-emptying. Creation is from nothing, not like nothing from an empty biscuit tin or something, sheer absolute nothing. Then the Word speaks, and all is ordered into being. The Spirit's breath breathes everything into life. An outpouring of grace from the divine, who is beyond being and non-being, the distinction thereof, the nothingness and everything. This empty pregnant plenitude, like the Virgin Mary's womb. Everything springs forth into being, creation. And then, because we're in time, we see it as a linear idea that Christ, the Word that spoke everything into being, descends among us in the incarnation, born in Bethlehem to the Blessed Virgin Mary, of the empty womb again. That emptiness and fullness motif keeps recurring. And then third, we see, again in time, because we're in time, the empty tomb. Christ is crucified. He's raised from the dead, from the emptiness of the tomb, emptiness to fullness, emptiness to absolute plenitude of eternal life. We perceive that as three movements because we're in time, but God is beyond time. And therefore you could say in one sense that the story of creation, the whole story of reality, starts on the cross. So I don't think that Christ is in any way peripheral to Dionysius's ideas. And the idea of kenosis, God as self-emptying act, not as a static being, but as God reveals himself to Moses, I am who I am, that strange four-letter Hebrew word, which in English letters is YHWH. I won't pronounce the sacred name out of respect, but Jewish people won't pronounce it. Every time you see in the Old Testament the word Lord written in capital letters, that's because actually it's the sacred name of God written there, YHWH, or Yod-He-Vav-He, meaning kind of I am who I am. That's how we translate it. Bit tricky because actually in Hebrew there's no present tense. Thomas Aquinas translates it, and so does Augustine, I think, as esse, the infinitive, the verb to be. Being not as a being, a thing, but as the unfolding of being itself from non-being. Kenosis, self-emptying, revealed and enacted and realized on the cross, in which Christians, I believe we take part liturgically, particularly at the Eucharist, when we empty ourselves of egotistical concerns through confession, and we receive Christ, so that in the old, the prayer of humble access, he dwells in us and we in him, mutual indwelling, mutual self-emptying. Christ empties himself from the cross for our sake, and we are drawn up, lifted up by his sacrifice through the bread and the wine at the altar. Yeah. So yes, I see a profound overlap between the idea of Nembutsu and the idea of kenosis, Christ's self-emptying. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, do we have any other questions? Mark? No. Okay. Not from internet. Okay, sure. Mark.
And questions of clarification and what have you, you're absolutely fine as well, please, because I realise not everyone might have read the book. Apologies.
Yeah. If we were to, other than by reading your book, what other sort of media or podcast or books would you recommend to get a little deeper into this, or to?
Yeah. Okay. Podcasts. There's, I've forgotten the name now. Peter Adamson. Peter Adamson's excellent philosophy podcast. A history of ideas in, I forget what, but a history of ideas. Peter Adamson. Look up Peter Adamson. Really, right from the dawns of time, right from the very beginnings of philosophy, and we're talking about not just Western philosophy, Indian philosophy, Arabic philosophy, Chinese philosophy. I mean, it's incredible what he's managed to do. You need a lot of hours to listen, but he's also put them in book form. If you read more quickly than you hear, that's very good. Books, I really recommend to anyone who's interested in Christian Platonism, Charles Williams, The Descent of the Dove, contemporary of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Sayers, who I mentioned earlier on, the lesser known of that little group in Oxford who met up in the pub called the Inklings, wrote some wonderful novels as well. But The Descent of the Dove is his mystical history of creation. Strongly recommend that. Likewise, the poems of George Herbert couldn't come more highly recommended. And I'd really recommend that you look at what Pusey House in Oxford is doing. They've got a conference on the descent of the dove coming up this summer, but they've got lectures that they broadcast on YouTube all the time, and they're very much, it's an Anglo-Catholic institution, which is very much based in Platonic Christianity, really. Also, the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Platonism has a lot of very interesting publications on this, and Douglas Headley's trilogy on the imagination. He's the director of the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Platonism. Very good, all available on Kindle.
Thank you. And I will try to, I'll ask you about this again when we finish, and try to put links for all of that into the description of the video, so that people can find that.
Thank you. I can give you the links. One more actually, Hassan Spiker's Things as They Are is also very good from an Islamic perspective on this.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Anything? We have a very quiet audience here. No? Okay, we do have a couple of minutes left. One question that occurred to me, you spoke earlier about God being beyond understanding. And then when you were talking about Shin Buddhism, you mentioned an experience that's beyond words. Some people might find this quite frustrating. You know, in an attempt to understand, you're told it's beyond understanding. You try to describe something that's beyond words. What can we hold on to? What can we find to guide us in all of this?
Yeah. Intellectually speaking, God, in his innermost essence, is surely beyond our comprehension. But God makes himself known rationally to us through all things, even the least likely things. Everything speaks to some extent of God. So God is in one sense noble and in one sense unknowable, and those two things have to be held in tension. Spiritually speaking, silence, but I mean real silence, where it's not just our surrounds that are silent, but our minds and our hearts are silent. Silent receptivity of God's grace, and the silence becomes a kind of language of its own. I think this is why so many people find music, especially non-verbal, non-lyrical music, so profoundly moving. Sadly, in society, we tend to see music and poetry as more entertainment, and all the real philosophy and literature, and the real philosophy is what's being done in the classroom or in the library. Well, let's take a leaf out of the old monastic book and think actually maybe it's the other way around. Poetry, the truths of poetry are in the gaps between the meanings of the words, and the poem expresses what it expresses because it cannot be put into prose. Music expresses, we heard some beautiful Michio Miyagi earlier on, expresses what it expresses in a way I couldn't explain to you the piece of music we just heard. I could talk about the key it was in, or maybe, or rhythms or something, but I couldn't. You've got to hear it. Actually, the Sufi mystics often say the closest apprehension we have to knowledge of God is taste, because that's the most direct. If I taste something, I can't really describe the taste apart from in relation to other tastes, but you still won't get it. You've got to taste it. I think that's the same with God. You've got to enter into the silence to know it, to know him, because the words ultimately will not suffice.
I think, as C.S. Lewis puts it, certain things about Christianity only make sense once you've gone a little way down that road.
Yeah, taste and see the Lord is good.
Yeah.
Yes. There are lots of obstacles, aren't there? Lots of obstacles, lots of material obstacles in particular, but also obstacles of the heart, obstacles of ambition and desire. And I think people are increasingly questioning whether all of those obstacles are actually very good, and realizing that they're not, but not having anything to turn to, not having any underlying, we can't address moral and spiritual questions unless we address metaphysical ones. We've got to address even physical ones unless we have the questions of principle, unless we're even willing at least to entertain those questions. Or, as I said, I think right at the beginning, it's just a house built on sand. Everything just comes down to what feels good for me. And that I think we're seeing quite clearly is not a way for any society to proceed. It doesn't work.
Yes. Now, we have another question. Okay, Mark, we'll finish with this.
Okay, this one's coming from Stephen Edmonds in London. Where does the Platonic tradition resonate most deeply for an Anglican in the pew at, say, Evensong or Holy Communion?
Hello, Stephen. Again, I'm not sure where the camera is, but nice to hear from you. How do you put this into a song? Right. Well, no, I've presupposed something there, haven't I? From the pulpit. I think actually in Evensong and at the Mass, if our liturgies are performed with reverence and beauty and dignity, then the very movement of the liturgies is, using the technical phrase, anagogical, uplifting, lifts us up to the divine. In fact, that's my own experience of it. As I said, I went to this service of benediction not knowing what on earth was going on, why there was a priest dressed in a coat lifting up some gold sun-shaped thing with something white in the middle. I didn't know it was the Blessed Sacrament being used to bless the people, but I knew instinctively, and this is an atheist who was not brought up in the church, something spoke to me. It wasn't the words. It wasn't. I have no idea what psalms were sung. I don't think there even was a sermon. But the music and the beauty lifted me up. It awakened my desire. The great theologian Hans von Balthasar said there's not enough eros in theology. We've got to be careful as Christians not to make this too much of a distinction between eros and agape and say there's some kind of non-erotic sublimated love that's different from the erotic yearning. No, we need to become lovers of God, and it's beauty that calls us to be lovers. So that's one part of the answer. But I'm not going to shy away from the question of the pulpit. I think that clergy need to preach metaphysical sermons and not just moral ones. I think we need to talk about what we're doing at the Eucharist, what Christ was doing for us on the cross, what creation is, and not just to bring out moral tropes or, I know Father Stephen Edmonds, and I know he doesn't do that. But my answer in a nutshell is we need metaphysical preaching before the moral will even make any sense.
Thank you. And before we finish, are there any final questions? Nothing else? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Father Thomas. It's been a very enjoyable talk, very interesting, enlightening. Is there anything you would like to say before we finish?
Thank you. Thank you very much for doing all of this and hosting it. And thank you for everybody who's braved the rains to come here and for everybody watching online. Very grateful for your interest. And I hope you'll enjoy the book if you haven't done so already.
Thank you. And for everybody here, there will be copies of the book available at the back of the church before you leave. So if you're here and you would like to buy a copy, or if you would like to have your copy signed, Father Thomas is here. We'll be able to do that today. If you're not in church today, but you will be in church in the near future, we will have copies here. Just ask somebody and we'll find that for you. Thank you again, Father Thomas. You talked about the importance of music and music as a way of connecting with God. So, to play us out, can we have, once again, Christian Traylor on the flute. Thank you very much.